Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Richard Hames, normally kept well out of sight in the audio department, where I sometimes host Novara FM, Novara's Big Ideas podcast. I am your host tonight, and fortunately, I am joined by the vastly more experienced Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Welcome, Helena. How are you doing tonight?
I'm not doing too bad. Absolute pleasure to join you on your foray into Novara Live. Looking forward to the show tonight.
Thank you very much. You'll be keeping this on the road, I think, hopefully. So coming up tonight, the Bank of England have cut interest rates for the first time since raising them in 2022. The Spycops inquiry continues and has today produced a rather eyebrow-raising moment. And Donald Trump has again courted controversy, this time by saying his opponent, Kamala Harris, quote, became black. So stay tuned for all of that. But first, more on the far-right riots in England. The 17-year-old suspect in the Southport stabbings has been named in court. Axel Rudikabana has appeared at Liverpool and Knowsley Youth Court, where he was charged with 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, and possession of a knife with a curved blade. This image is obviously of a much younger Rudikabana, one of several out-of-date photographs that have been released. Later, he appeared at Liverpool Crown Court, where the judge ruled that Rudikabana's anonymity could be lifted, allowing him to be named in the media. Now, people under the age of 18 are normally entitled to full anonymity if involved in criminal proceedings, but the prosecutor in the case argued that, on balance, lifting Rudikabana's anonymity was in the public interest, given the far-right riots that have broken out over the case. He argued that naming Rudikabana would decrease the risk of potential violent misidentification of others. The Daily Mail was in court too. The newspaper argued that Rudikabana should be named, following a widespread misinformation campaign on social media that resulted in riots and accusations that the media had lied about details of the suspect. The police, however, had a different view, asking that Rudikabana's anonymity be maintained until his 18th birthday, which is next week, so that they could properly safeguard his family. In his ruling, the judge said, continuing to prevent the full reporting has the disadvantage of allowing others to spread misinformation in a vacuum. Whilst I accept it is exceptional, given his age, principally because he is 18 in 6 days' time, I do not make an order under Section 45. A Section 45 order is an order to prohibit reporting on a suspect. Other details about Rudikabana have been released by police in the recent days. Born in Cardiff to Rwandan parents, he lived in the village of Banks outside Southport. This is how a neighbour described his home life to the BBC. They were a lovely young couple. They were little boys. They were boisterous. Mum was a stay-at-home mum. Dad was nice. He went to work every day. They had a small family car, a little hatchback. Other neighbours have described the family as heavily involved in the local church. Helena, this is, of course, a horrendous story in a huge number of different ways. Do you think the judge was right to lift the suspect's anonymity?
I think broadly, I would agree with the decision to release the name on this one and remove the anonymity. I think there are lots of good arguments on both sides, even if I do fall down on one side specifically. I think that the scenes that we had seen over the last few days, quelling the rumours and any amount of speculation, which is essentially what led us to this in the first place. Disinformation was allowed to spread that led to groups being corralled into engaging in the scenes that we have seen over the last couple of days, essentially has only been because, they were looking for a Muslim, regardless of whether one was going to be there. So releasing the identity to ensure that that doesn't happen moving forward certainly has a lot of merit to it. Of course, when you talk about protecting the family, now that those rumors have allowed to go around the social media networks, right? This kind of changes the way in which we have to look at these things. And in the age of social media disinformation, I can understand why people would say, well, actually, look, no, things are really, really heated up right now. It's really heated up. And people are angry now regardless. It doesn't matter whether or not it was a Muslim who did it or not. It doesn't matter the ethnicity of the person or which country that their parents came from or whether they were born in the UK or not. People are now very angry because of the information vacuum immediately after the incident happened, which has led to the kind of anger that we've seen. And that could now get redirected towards the family of the suspect in this case. So I can understand why the police is especially saying, well, we don't want to have any further disturbances. We don't want any further levels of incidents that might impugn the family themselves rather than the ideas that they had in their heads when they didn't know the actual identity of the suspect in those cases. But broadly, I think they're trying to put a stop to it now and end to it now so we can properly discuss these things with the full context in mind, given his 18th birthday was so close. I broadly think the judge was correct.
Just to remind our audience what sparked all of this, this is the case in which 3 small girls were murdered and many other injured in an attack. In lifting Rudy Cubana's anonymity, the judge referenced the spread of online misinformation about the case. Following a violent and Islamophobic far-right riot in Southport on Tuesday night, the flood of lies about the case on social media led to further mobs taking to streets across England last night. In London, more than 110 people were arrested after violent clashes with police broke out at a demonstration outside Downing Street. Protesters were seen hurling flares and bottles at police while chanting, "We want our country back and save our kids." Assistant Metropolitan Police Commissioner Matt Twist said this about the riots. Last night, our officers faced unacceptable scenes of disorder and violence, as others across the country have done in recent days. They acted with great courage and the highest levels of professionalism in face of hateful behaviour. All our thoughts should be with the victims and families of those impacted by the most dreadful attack in Southport. It is shameful that some have sought to exploit this tragedy as justification for their own violence and criminality. There is absolutely no place for this on our streets. We will ensure that anyone involved in any violent disorder and criminal behaviour will be stopped, arrested, and will face justice. In Hartlepool, far-right groups also gathered to cause mayhem. 8 people were arrested and 2 officers were injured after a large group confronted police. Eggs, missiles, and bottles were thrown while a police car was set on fire. This video appears to show the mob attacking a bystander of Asian heritage.
Turn in. Oh! Fucking hell, I caught that. Fucking hell, as if I caught that. Screen recorder? Nah, man, I hope so. I fucking was. Good call us. Good call us. He's just been assaulted, that gentleman.
As you can see, just a completely unprovoked attack there on someone who almost certainly has absolutely nothing to do with any of this. There were further clashes in Newton Heath, in Manchester. Around 40 people, including children and people wearing balaclavas, gathered outside a hotel in the suburb. The crowd soon turned violent, pelting police with bottles and injuring a bus driver. Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham said this about the riots. "I'm struggling to comprehend what happened last night. There's a situation where people are rushing to judgment without the facts. No one knows the full story. It's a despicable criminal act. I think we are in a dangerous moment. People need to step back. Greater Manchester is better than this. A random gathering attacking police and people with nothing to do with the situation in Southport." And in response to the rash of far-right protests, Keir Starmer met with police chiefs today. At a press conference following that meeting, the Prime Minister announced this.
"I can announce today that following this meeting, we will establish a national capability across police forces to tackle violent disorder. These thugs are mobile. They move from community to community. And we must have a policing response that can do the same. Shared intelligence, wider deployment of facial recognition technology, and preventative action, criminal behaviour orders to restrict their movements before they can even board a train, in just the same way that we do with football hooligans. And let me also say to large social media companies and those who run them, violent disorder clearly whipped up online, that is also a crime. It's happening on your premises, and the law must be upheld everywhere. That is the single most important duty of government, Service rests on security, and we will take all necessary action to keep our streets safe.
Elena, I want to get to you now. This is, of course, as I said before, an utterly horrendous story, but with very far-reaching implications that seemingly have very little to do with the initial trigger. So wondering, how do you understand the spread of rioting? We saw it in localized places last night, but now it's sort of nationwide. How do you understand the way in which that's spread?
I mean, at the end of the day, I think this is the end result of these narratives being placated by our politicians. It's all well and good, Keir Starmer, now that he's in government, saying, well, we're going to have all of these plans. Well, I'm like, well, when you were on LBC answering callers, literally someone called in to talk about their far-right conspiracy theory nonsense, and you didn't even bother trying to rebut it with any kind of fact-based rebuttal of what they were saying. You tried to placate the position they were holding on because you were scared about losing these people's votes. This has happened on many sides of the political spectrum, on very large platforms where politicians have refused to tackle the kind of conspiracy theories that we've seen going on in the background that have been disseminated by intellectuals, indeed using social media to be able to do that, right? It's all coming out the halls of intelligentsia, passing these things down, talking about the fall of the West, talking about the World Economic Forum and all this kind of nonsense that they're trying to say are undermining our countries by importing people, for example. That's where a lot of these the narratives that have had to spread these things have come from. It's very easy to imagine that it is the work of some devious fifth column rather than it just being something that's happened because of something systemic. And of course, these feelings that we have seen from people, right? Of course, the specific groups who are the ringleaders who help spread these things, they are a problem. But you don't draw upon a base of support from across the country, whether it be London or Hartlepool or Southport or Manchester. You do not draw on groups of disparate people from across the country into those movements without there being an overarching way of being able to bring them together. And that is the problem that we have seen, again, through implications from politicians and intellectuals, but also the complacency of journalists who haven't bothered, especially in the mainstream media, from looking and seeing the kind of radicalizations that's been going on in real time. And they have just spent their time talking about other things. In fact, I literally saw a right-wing journalist on LBC last night saying, we don't have a far-right problem in the country, but we do have a far-left problem with the pro-Hamas marches. And I'm just like, this is completely ridiculous. Why we are trying to compare a broadly peaceful protest movement to the kind of scenes that we've seen across the country. Random people getting attacked entirely based upon essentially the color of their skin in the scene that was from that video that you showed earlier. These things do not happen in a vacuum, and there has to be the basis for them, both material and also ideological elsewhere. And these are all problems that we have allowed to simmer because we have refused to take them on. And it's both the right and the left of politics that failed to do that.
I think the far right is very clearly feeling really emboldened at the moment. And my guess is that this anger won't immediately subside. So you mentioned there the need for sort of something more transformative to address this problem, not only of the immediate anger, but of the far right organizing in communities across the country. What might that be? Just to give a piece of color on there, I went to a Tommy Robinson demo last Saturday and covered that for Novara. And there was a real deep sense of confusion, exactly the kinds of conspiracies that you are talking about there with the World Economic Forum and very nebulous outsiders who are coming into people's communities and transforming them. So what kind of response can there be from the left that could resolve or start to heal some of those divisions?
The very first thing, of course, is that, as always, these things have a material basis that underpins them. The one thing that we should be doing is fixing material conditions. Now, of course, a lot of these people come from communities that were ruined by deindustrialization and have never recovered. This is now obviously the fault of the complete lax economic approach that we've seen from various neoliberal governments over the last 45 years. But, of course, once that is done at the same time as we have seen the explosion of wealth amongst the super rich and the elites in this country, without a material basis to understand why this has happened, your point towards the confusion is very correct. It's clear there is a very clear reason as to why. Start that again. There's clearly a reason why this has happened specifically to them. This hasn't come out of nowhere, and we can't just say it's just bad people doing bad things because they're bad. There has to be a systemic reason for this. Now, I will, on top of the material conditions, there has been a lot of I can't try and think of the best words to describe it, but the way in which people have been looked down on from these communities, specifically amongst kind of liberal types. Eddie Dempsey talked about this a lot when talking around the kind of people who feel like that they cannot identify with the labor movement anymore, is because the institutions of these communities have been taken over by liberal types who don't quite understand the reasons why these communities have been taken down. I literally saw, like, this was exemplified a lot by someone I saw from the kind of liberal side of politics, who was laughing at somebody who voted Brexit, for example, who now lost their job at Port Talbot Steelworks partly due to Brexit. And rather than empathizing with these people and understanding that loads of communities have lost all of their wealth because of the kind of economic policies that have been taken on over the last 45 years, they had no empathy, no sympathy at all, just derision for people making the wrong choices nowadays. That has to stop. But these communities need to be rebuilt. We need to bring material wealth back to these communities so that they can come together, not just in a social sense, but an economic sense as well. Of course, I think these things are very much go hand in hand. So restoring like the strength of local authorities, restoring local authority ownership of things within one's community. I think Lisa Nandy's plan on community right to buy has some legs with that. And of course, restoring the public sector, restoring our social sector that is there specifically for communities as well, and the rise of third places. So we actually get to know the people around us rather than being divided, which has happened a lot because of a very kind of individualist worldview that we have. Of course, the individualist base has informed a superstructure of people who don't really bond with their community in the same way as they had done previously. Legislatively, in the short term, though, I absolutely agree with what Angela Rayner said yesterday, and I think there was a really large case for prescribing a lot of these groups. Of course, the EDL and their kind of hanger-on groups like Patriotic Alternative, for example. If Hizb ut-Tahrir as a group can be prescribed because of the social views that they want to impose upon the rest of the country, I think that you can make the exact same case for these far-right groups as well.
In some ways, I want to sort of push back on the idea that we should be prescribing far-right groups, at least from what I've seen about these particular disturbances. There's a combination of, on the one hand, a organized hardcore far-right. Patriotic Alternative is a very good example there, but also lots of sort of opportunism, lots of quite nebulous, ill-defined networks of people that are being mobilized. And I'm not quite sure how you can prescribe a collection of sort of intuitions about the world, a sort of collection of far-right intuitions about how the world works and what the right response to social problems is. I also be kind of hesitant in some ways to agree to further police powers. I think Keir Starmer in his statement earlier mentioned facial recognition technologies, which for me looks like a worrying infringement of civil liberties.
I get that. I absolutely do. I understand that. But I think that these groups are so well networked already as they are, that the specific groupings that have been made currently, I think, given that it's not any extra specific power that they are being given, I wouldn't want an expansion of police power. I wouldn't want them to be given any extra remit, but expanding the scope of the groups that we deem to be bad for social cohesion, at the very least, the ones that have the organizing structure already built, I think that can help fix things in the very short term. But of course, when it comes to the kind of these disparate feelings that you're seeing across the country that don't have a networked basis to them already in the same kind of official structure that you see from groups like PA, I think that, of course, everything I said before about fixing them with the underlying material and social conditions, that is what we're going to have to do in the long term. But I understand your skepticism of anything that's going to come from the top down rather than from the bottom up.
The Bank of England has cut its base rate of interest. That's the rate that the bank uses to lend to other banks. After a decade of ultra-low rates, the bank increased its rates every time they met throughout 2022 and 23 in response to soaring inflation. It's remained at 5.2% for the last 12 months until today, when Bank of England governors voted for a cut of 0.25% down to 5%. That might not seem like much, but it's a clear indication that the bank's view on inflation has shifted. The higher the base rate is, the more it's supposed to rein in inflation. So now the base rate is coming down, it's perhaps a sign that the bank is satisfied with falling inflation levels. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has welcomed the move, although she did say that, quote, millions of families are still facing higher mortgage rates after the mini budget. That mini budget was the one put out by Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, widely seen as having led to an enormous amount of turmoil in the British economy. Although 5% is still very high compared to recent years, Zooming out a little bit, we can see that this cut announced today looks like we're returning to a low interest rate environment that was itself a bit of an exception. For most of the last 45 years, as shown on this graph, except from the decade from 2010, interest rates have been this high or even much higher. So, has inflation decisively calmed down? That's a question I put to Lydia Prieg, Head of Economics at the New Economics Foundation.
The rate cut obviously means that the Bank of England have confidence that, or reasonable confidence, that inflation is, as a general trend, on its way down and on its way out. However, I should add that most people are expecting inflation to slightly tick upwards again in the autumn, actually due to the decrease in energy prices reducing over the autumn, but then is expected to fall again by the end of the year, so that it will be a slightly bumpy inflation ride, but hopefully the overall trend should be it's starting to come down now.
So inflation isn't just one measure, it's a sort of based on a basket of goods. So which of those might be coming down faster or at different speeds from others? Is it in services or in goods, or is it across the board that we're seeing the inflation numbers come down?
In general, on things like clothing and food, we're really seeing prices starting to come down. On things like hospitality and leisure, prices have been higher. And obviously, we're about to approach the autumn when people in general will be starting to spend more money on heating and energy bills. So like the cost of living crisis will remain very present in many people's lives. And it's also important to reflect on the fact that even though interest rates are hopefully now starting to come down, although the Bank of England has been very keen to reassure people that they're not going to go too fast, they're going to be very cautious about how they reduce rates. For many people who, for example, have fixed rate mortgages, which weren't remortgaged and reset in a past year or two, they could still be seeing some quite big mortgage rate increases from what they're used to. So a lot of people are still going to be having to adjust to a higher mortgage rate world as well.
I guess this kind of measure from the Bank of England often seems to lots of people quite grey, quite obscure. Maybe let's make it sort of more tangible. Who benefits from a rate cut?
People on tracker mortgages that track the Bank of England base rate should immediately start to see benefits. I think the average benefit for somebody on that sort of mortgage would be around £28 a month. People on standard variable rates mortgages should also hopefully on average benefit, albeit by less. Estimates there are around by about £15 per month. But obviously, if you're on a fixed rate mortgage right now, you're not immediately going to see any kind of change unless you're immediately getting that rate changed. Now, also, if you look at savers, for example, well, in theory, obviously, this should be starting to maybe hurt them slightly as interest rates fall, and they should start to be receiving less money on their savings. But it is also worth pointing out that banks aren't always very good at passing on the benefits of rate rises anyway to savers, unfortunately. But nonetheless, for savers, this maybe wouldn't be the happiest of news.
We've not seen a great deal of ambitious spending promises from this new government. And that's obviously concerning in some ways because of things like climate change, not getting the requisite resources they need. Does this kind of monetary policy change mean that those kind of spending commitments might be given a little bit of a nudge?
You make a very valid point about the effect that this high interest rate environment has had on important investments, well, investments in general, and obviously the UK economy in general is crying out for investment. But there's also very key strategic sectors that have been really struggling as a result of the higher rates. So, for example, last autumn, there was a failed offshore wind auction where companies could bid for price contracts for the next 15 years to provide offshore wind. And actually, no companies ended up putting in bids. And they cited cost concerns, in particular the rate rises. So, these higher rates have really punished investment, including in really crucial sectors like the green economy. So obviously these rates starting to come down should help with that. Although obviously, just a quarter of a percentage point that we've seen today, obviously by itself isn't that much in comparison to the large increases we've seen. It also obviously affects government debt and makes it slightly cheaper for governments to borrow. So in theory, making the government finances, putting the government finances in a slightly easier situation.
So between about 2010 and 2022, we had a period of extremely low, historically low interest rates. Are we likely to be returning to that, or are you likely to be resetting back towards a more sort of normal rate, historically speaking, of sort of 5 or even above that many percentage points?
So I think we should certainly come down ultimately to a level that's significantly lower than what we've been experiencing for the past couple of years. But will we go back down to rock bottom rates? I mean, I'm doubtful, because a lot of the forces that helped drive that are now starting to subside slightly. So, for example, globalization was a very big force that helped drive down prices. But now we've got a lot of concerns about increasing protectionism and trade wars, and people wanting to, for example, diversify their supply chains away from China. So all of that means that we might not return to that sort of super cheap global products place where we were at previously. Similarly, many people are worried about climate change and the fact that things like extreme weather events are going to become increasingly more severe and increasingly more common, and that can have all sorts of inflationary impacts, for example, as we've seen on things like food prices. So there's also the concern that those sort of factors will start picking up more regularly as well.
The undercover policing inquiry, also known as the Spycops inquiry, is a statutory government inquiry into undercover policing in England and Wales. Initiated by Theresa May in 2015, it's been looking into allegations of abuse, dishonesty, and criminality in the conduct of undercover police since 2017. The first tranche of the inquiry concluded last year after examining the activities of the Metropolitan Police's Special Operations Squad between 1968 and 1982. It revealed a coordinated effort of deeply illegal activity by police to infiltrate and sabotage progressive movements in Britain. Tranche 2 of the inquiry was opened earlier this year, looking into the conduct of undercover police from the early 1980s into the 90s. Included in that period is the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, who was beaten to death in 1993. And significantly, the efforts undercover police made to infiltrate groups seeking justice for the 18-year-old black man. One black police officer, who used the name Anthony Lewis, has already been revealed by the inquiry to have spied on the Lawrence family's campaign to bring Stephen's killers to justice. His real name is Trevor Morris, and he spent 4 years pretending to be a left-wing anti-racist campaigner. And in his efforts to gather information on the Lawrence family's campaign, he deceived women into a long-term relationship using his fake identity. Trevor Morris has been giving further evidence at the inquiry, which is live-streamed. Except, as Morris was discussing the police's role in discrediting the Lawrence family, this happened.
Did he say anything to you to the effect that he'd been asked to gather intelligence with which to smear the Lawrence family?
I heard this subsequently, and I thought that was, no disrespect to Peter, I thought nonsense. That's not what we're about. We're about gathering intelligence, not smearing individuals. That's a security service job. Let them do that. We're bothered about gathering intelligence. That's what we were doing.
Just to be clear.
Sorry, I shouldn't say that.
Just to be clear, you are you not?
Let's scrap that last bit. I'm not saying that.
Are you or are you not in a position to say whether or not the security service was seeking to smear?
That was the inquiry's stream cutting out. Just at the moment, the activities of the British security services were coming into view. And the stream was all suspended for almost an hour before inquiry chair John Mitting was broadcast making these remarks.
Ms. Barr, before you resume, may I say to those behind that there is a purpose in these orders. I know that you have complied with them up to now. They are serious orders. They do have a potentially serious consequence if they're breached. please, I ask of you as well as demand of you, comply with what the order requires you to do. A transcript in due course will be published, which will contain part of that which was said between the hours of 11:16 and 11:22, but only part of it.
I'm joined now by Tom Fowler, host of the Spycops podcast, who has been covering undercover policing inquiry extensively. Tom, can you first tell us more about this extraordinary moment in the inquiry earlier today? What was your reaction to it?
To be honest, it wasn't anything that we didn't already know. We've been very well aware that the role of the Special Demonstration Squad and the relationship that it has with the security service was one of like a customer relationship, that they, as you heard Trevor Morris saying there, they collected the evidence and they passed it on to the security services. I mean, it goes deeper than that. Essentially, the security services would provide shopping lists, as they called them, of specific information they wanted to know about campaigners, about organisations, and they passed that information. Then was passed on back from the SDS to the security services, who would act on it.
Moments like this will get a lot of attention, but there's a huge amount coming out from the inquiry that isn't getting nearly as much attention as this. As it probably needs, to be frank. You've been just in the inquiry, I should say to our audience. That's why you are sat on a train station, because you literally just come out. What are you seeing in this inquiry that feels of particular significance that might not get quite as much attention as this blooper?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to recap who the SDS were, the Spycops. This was a secret undercover unit of political police, part of Special Branch, who were deployed into pretty much anyone across the left, the entirety of progressive forces, very, very little infiltration of the far right. They were deployed for about 5 years. They would take the name of a dead child and they would assume that identity, and not just the name, but everything about the identity. They would travel to where that person was born. They would spy on the family. They would get an idea of where they would have gone to school, where they might have ended up working, and use that as the basis of their legend. Many of them deceived women into long-term intimate relationships, for many years on end, and in some cases father children with them. I mean, we'd established that before the inquiry started. What the inquiry has done really is like kind of fill in all the detail. I mean, there are many shocking examples of things that happened. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about the Welling protest against the BNP headquarters. We've seen the sort of the intelligence reports leading up to that, which Trevor Morris in this case was filing, and a number of undercover officers, which was really like hyping up that supposedly the anti-Nazi League were going to burn down the bookshop, and really led to the extreme over-policing and the incredibly violent day that day. What happened at Welling, it was a bit of it's referred to by Lindsay German, who convener of Stop the War Coalition, who was on the Central Committee of the SWP at the time, as a medieval battlefield. And we really see the sort of, the relationship that existed between these spy cops and the rest of the infrastructure of repression that exists in the UK. Little detail is by itself not particularly newsworthy, but when you put it together, you can really get a picture of how pernicious and how widespread this undermining of political protest groups in the UK has been since 1968. I mean, the unit was shut down in the late 2000s, but was sort of replaced by another unit called the National Public Order Intelligence Unit that was only shut down when Mark Kennedy was exposed in 2010. Since then, we're sure it exists now in some form, but it really gives us an idea of how much how far the British state is willing to go to stop political protest.
Really quite a speculative question, maybe a sort of conspiratorial one in a way. But what's your sense of what has changed or not changed in undercover policing up until the present?
It's hard to know, right? The more you know about a specific historical period, the less you want to speculate on the current sort of scenario. There's nothing to suggest that things have changed in terms of what the police want to know. I'm sure the methods have changed quite significantly. I mean, we live in an era of neoliberal policing, right? So, there's a lot of subbing out to private contractors that happens across the board. We know that the criminal informants database is enormous, so that's going to be a huge part of it as well. And of course, there's all the electronic surveillance that's now possible, which wasn't for the majority of the history of the Special Demonstration Squad. But in terms of like what Special Branch are doing in terms of desk roles, that won't have changed in the slightest. It'll just be a tactical change. This is the thing, when people talk about what we've learned in terms of what we can apply to the current day, it's not really about the tactics they use so much, but more what they're interested in. And what we see of that is these huge, huge lists of names, addresses, personal information, connections, physical descriptions, everything about people. This is then fed into what they called vetting, what we call blacklisting, where they would make sure that people who were involved in political protests were unable to get work in areas of influence in the UK, whether that was the civil service, the BBC, or other situations. I mean, we had an example the other day of someone who was spied upon. We saw the reports. He was somebody who was homosexual, and it was pointed out that he was though he was out within the political group he was in, he wasn't in his general life, and he was working for the civil service. And this was an opportunity to entrap him and use him as a proxy. A lot of the sort of recruiting of informers is done, it would appear, through that kind of blackmail as opposed to, kind of paying them off or whatever else people might think.
This inquiry is moving really quite slowly through the history of the scandal, so we're still a long way from the present day. And I'm wondering what you think is coming up in the inquiry that people should keep their eyes open for. Obviously, things like this they can't really plan for, but is anything in particular coming up that you think people should be aware of?
Very much. I mean, we're about to have a break in the inquiry again at the end of this, in a couple of days' time. We're just coming to the end of this phase. The second phase starts again in September. We'll be hearing from a lot of the more famous undercover officers like Bob Lambert and John Dines. Bob Lambert had 4 relationships while he was deployed undercover and fathered 1 child. He firebombed the Debenhams whilst supposedly as an animal rights activist. He went on to lead the unit. He went on to be involved in the setting up of the Muslim contact unit and wrote Prevent, essentially. We heard about John Dines, who infiltrated London Greenpeace. He had a long-term relationship with Helen Steele. He famously wrote part of the What's Wrong with McDonald's leaflet that led to McLibel.
You said they infiltrated the left, but not so much the far right. While you're in the inquiry today, Keir Starmer announced a new unit to deal with the type of far-right riots we've seen over the last few days. I was wondering if you have any immediate comments on that unit and whether or not you think that will be effective at dealing with that kind of problem.
Whatever they say, it will be used against. You can bet your bottom dollar that the state will just use it for like a wide range of social control. We only need to look at what's happened to Just Stop Oil recently, the preemptive arrests of Youth Demand Justice Now before the King's speech. Whatever supposed reason the legislation is put in place to launch these kind of units, they'll be used against progressive forces. I'm not entirely convinced they'll be used against the far right in the same way. They certainly haven't historically. During this phase of hearings, we've heard from one officer who infiltrated the far right. Unlike all the other officers who went in for like 5 years and gave detailed reports, he was in for 10 months, gave a handful of reports, and withdrew himself as soon as it got difficult in any way. There's a huge difference in the way in which the state approaches what it considers to be problematic groups on the left. And, as we've heard from some of the undercover officers, when they were talking about the National Front in the 1970s, they claimed they weren't a problem because they cooperated with the police. They believed in the Queen. There's a very different sort of approach to the way that the far right gets dealt with by the state.
Donald Trump has appeared at the conference for the National Association of Black Journalists. Usually this kind of event is a pretty anodyne opportunity for politicians to get their message across. And this is a key group of people for Trump to win over. Many voters in key swing states are black. But this event didn't go quite to plan.
A lot of people did not think it was appropriate for you to be here today. You have pushed false claims about some of your rivals, from Nikki Haley to former President Barack Obama, saying that they were not born in the United States, which is not true. You have told 4 congresswomen of color who were American citizens to go back to where they came from. You have used words like animal and rabid to describe black district attorneys. You've attacked black journalists, calling them a loser, saying the questions that they ask are, quote, stupid and racist. You've had dinner with a white supremacist at your Mar-a-Lago resort. So my question, sir, now that you are asking black supporters to vote for you, why should black voters trust you after you have used language like that?
Well, first of all, I don't think I've ever been asked a question so in such a horrible manner. First question. You don't even say, hello, how are you? Are you with ABC? Because I think they're a fake news network, a terrible network. And I think it's disgraceful that I came here in good spirit. I love the black population of this country. I've done so much for the black population of this country, including employment, including opportunity zones with Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, which is one of the greatest programs ever for black workers and black entrepreneurs. I've done so much, and and I say this, historically black colleges and universities were out of money, they were stone cold broke, and I saved them, and I gave them long-term financing, and nobody else was doing it. I think it's a very rude introduction. I don't know exactly why you would do something like that.
Trump didn't really like the questions, but it was a fairly comprehensive summary of Trump's litany of statements about black Americans. Although some punches were actually pulled there, Trump has a history of not just saying racist things about black people, but also racist policies in the Trump organization before he even got into politics. Just one example is that in 1973, Trump management was sued by the US Department of Justice for discrimination against prospective black renters. Back to the Q&A. Here's what he had to say his message to black voters was.
My message is to stop people from invading our country that are taking, frankly, a lot of problems with it. But one of the big problems, and a lot of the journalists in this room I know and I have great respect for, a lot of the journalists in this room are black. I will tell you that coming from the border are millions and millions of people that happen to be taking black jobs. You had the best.
What exactly is a black job, sir?
A black job is anybody that has a job. That's what it is. Anybody that has a job.
All right.
And
Mr.
they're taking the employment away from black people. They're coming in, they're invading. It's an invasion of millions of people, probably 15, 16, 17 million people. I have a feeling it's much more than that. And everybody's been seeing what's happened. The first group of people, the black population, is affected most by that. And Kamala is allowing it to happen. She's the border czar. She's the worst border czar in the history of the world. There's never been a border czar like this. She's never even essentially been. She said she was there once, but not the right part of the border. So she was a border czar. She's done a horrible job. These people are coming into our country, and they're taking black jobs and Hispanic jobs. And frankly, they're taking union jobs. Unions are being very badly affected by all of the millions of people that are pouring into our country.
That was what Trump said his message was to black voters when asked. And those comments on black jobs are very transparently an attempt to pit Mexicans or other minorities against black people in the US. Later on, he made some quite extraordinary and obviously false claims about his electoral opponent, Kamala Harris.
Some of your own supporters, including Republicans on Capitol Hill, have labeled Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first black and Asian American woman to serve as vice president and be on a major party ticket, as a DEI hire. Is that acceptable language to you? And will you tell those Republicans and those supporters to stop it?
How do you define DEI? Go ahead. How do you define
diversity, equity, inclusion?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Is that what your definition?
That is
give me a
literally
definition then. Would you give me a definition
DEI.
of that? Give me a definition.
Sir, I'm asking you a question, a very direct question.
Define it for me, if you would.
I just defined it, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a black woman?
Well, I can say no. I think it's maybe a little bit different. So I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much. And she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She is always identified as a black woman. She went to a historically black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn and she became a black person.
Just to be
Of course, there's an enormous number of things to say about that clip, but what I find most extraordinary is for the first perhaps 40 seconds, you can see he's trying to buffer and ask about, what do you mean by DEI? What do you mean by DEI? What is that really? What is that really? While he's obviously thinking at the same time, what am I going to say next? And this is the thing that he comes out with. Of course, the two ethnicities aren't mutually exclusive. Her father was black and her mother was Indian. But it's also a pretty strange approach to racial categories to insist that everyone must neatly fall into just one, particularly a society made up like America, which is almost entirely migrants of one form or another. We'll have many millions of people who don't fit neatly into any given category. It's a sort of a segregationist's idea of the world, that every race is somehow its own separate thing, and that's where everyone stays. The first part of the answer was revealing as well, of course. DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, has become something of a boogeyman for the American right in recent years. When Trump was almost assassinated, some on the American right tried to explain the Secret Service's failure by pointing to DEI as an apparent culprit.
So when it comes to the stuff about DEI, I think that it actually has a lot more of an interesting conversation around it than a lot of people think. People just kind of throw it away saying, oh, well, they're just being racist or whatever. I mean, what's kind of central to this becoming part of like the right-wing lexicon in terms of how they discuss race issues in the United States, for example, and it's coming in over here. Liz Truss tried it for a bit, but it didn't really work in the same way, is the specific bogeyman that they're attacking here is this idea, this almost, again, yet another kind of conspiracy that they have, that for some reason corporations, corporate America, and their kind of allies in the Democratic Party or whatever it might be, are trying to force DEI upon people. Of course, DEI just means some kind of it's the diversity that they take kind of issue here with. Like this, they're kind of trying to force, they're having forced diversity. It's happening amongst their TV shows, the media that they consume, and within politics, for example. And where they've got this from is this idea, well, companies will have DEI departments to maintain their commitments to DEI or whatever. Now, what this is, of course, is just a way of stopping themselves falling foul of equality legislation so that they save money by not getting sued. But they, for some reason, have thought that what these people are doing is actually ideological in nature. These aren't profit seekers seeking profit by appealing to a marketplace or by making sure they don't fall foul of equalities legislation. They think that the people at the top of these companies, the people like Larry Fink or Klaus Schwab or whatever, are deliberately trying to undermine what they view to be the correct kind of diversity mix-up within these companies. It's a really kind of strange conspiracy that they've got going on. But of course, that has kind of become a more kind of big tent issue, which has become, again, another thing that we've heard all these times, the way in which they couch their language. For example, when they talk about, it used to be politically correct, and then it's woke, and then it's DEI, whatever it might be. Because it's not actually really and truly about any kind of perceived wrongness. It's just their kind of innate dislike of it not looking the same way that it used to, hence why Make America Great Again was such a strong campaign for these kind of people. As for Trump's comments about Kamala Harris's ethnicity specifically, I think that when it comes to Donald Trump, we spend a lot of time analysing the things that he says in good faith. In general, I just think he's an idiot. I just think he's really stupid. I think that's the big problem that we have here, is that I don't think this is a comment that just show that he understands what he's talking about. He just says whatever he makes up as he goes along, and people take it far too seriously rather than just completely brushing with it. This is moronic, in my opinion, personally.
I agree with you, absolutely, yeah, moronic. But it's also pernicious in a very deep way, because it means that any time that anybody who is not white has a job, they can be understood to be some sort of DEI hire. Everyone is cast doubt on. I do also want to agree with you on the corporate stuff and how sort of strange it is that corporations in the imaginary of the American right have been understood to have very clearly defined politics, to the point where, I think it was a few years ago, Tucker Carlson, the American right-wing host, had a list of left-wing companies and right-wing companies. And I believe that in the list of left-wing companies, there were placed things such as Raytheon, which is a weapons company, because it had some sort of pro-diversity hiring policy. There is one last clip I want to go to a bit later on from this Trump interview, where Trump starts to complain about the fact that he is no longer running against Biden.
I was running against a man named Biden. You probably saw that. And he was losing very badly in the polls. And then he had a rather bad debate. I would say it was a bad debate. I would say it was one of the worst debates in history. And his poll numbers crashed. And instead of saying, let's keep going and maybe something happens the other way, they said, oh, we're going to replace him. Let's just replace him. That's like you're in a fight, a prize fighter's in a fight. He's not doing what you say, let's bring in another fighter. So our whole campaign was steered toward him. and now we have to steer it to it. But ultimately, it's the same because they have bad policy.
Helena, I want to get your reaction here. Is Trump floundering?
Yeah, 100% believe that he's floundering here. I think that the issue that they've got, so in 2016 and 2020, especially in 2016 when he won the election, he was the outsider. He was the outsider running against, this kind of representative of a political dynasty, right? It's been decades since we have had a presidential ticket which hasn't had a Biden, a Clinton, or a Bush on it. You have to go back to I believe it's like the 1980s you have to go back to, until one of these political dynasties wasn't part of the ticket. So Trump coming in as the kind of anti-politics candidate, even though he really is a political candidate, the man's got so much connection to big business, basically run politics in America at this point. But he wasn't part of the political class, so got to run against these very established, very long-term candidates like Biden, like Clinton, on the baggage that they had that they were carrying over, their history as politicians, their position as being the kind of persona non grata in terms of American politics, in terms of what the right believe, and of course those who are disengaged with politics believe them all to be the same. And so we talk about things like Benghazi when it came to Hillary Clinton. He could attack Joe Biden over the police and crime bill, the Biden crime bill that was discussed a lot of the time beforehand. And when it comes to Kamala Harris, she's been a senator for a decade. She's not got decades of political history. She's not part of a dynasty. And I don't think they really know enough about her politics. The attacks that they now have on her, when they can't just attack Biden for his age anymore, they don't know what they're doing. Like, there was literally a clip I saw somewhere posted saying, look at this thing, this scandalous revelation about Kamala Harris, and that she agreed with Bernie Sanders about Medicare for all during the election debates. And I'm like, Americans like these policies, right? Like, they don't just dislike it because you just say that it's left-wing or socialist. They want their healthcare to be cheaper. They hate healthcare in America. This is a popular policy. So he can't attack them as being an outsider, especially not after he's been president for 4 years and essentially been the head of the Republican Party for almost 12 at this point. The idea that somehow they can attack from being on the outside, they have no attack lines anymore. And they'll try and attack her ostensibly from the left, but this kind of ACAB politics that we criticize Kamala for from the left, that doesn't play well with swing voters either. They don't really have anywhere to go. And you can see the problems that they had. It's why they wanted to organize this interview with Black Journalists of America, because somewhere where Trump is increasing his vote share as among ethnic minority communities, especially Black men, for example, young Black men have been kind of moving towards the Trumpian base because, again, he feels like he's outside of politics. And then now these actually interact with them. It's a complete car crash. And I think that the more these incidents happen, and the closer they get to the election, these kind of failures of messaging will become far more prominent and far more widespread. And if it continues, I think that will really trouble him come the election.
Before we finish, a quick note to say that GPs in England have voted to take industrial action for the first time in 60 years. The dispute with the government is over a mere 1.9% increase in the budget awarded to GP services this year. Family doctors say that the result of this below-inflation increase will leave many practices struggling to stay afloat. We don't know what form the action will take yet, but options include limiting the number of patients seen each day and refusing to be bound by prescription rationing. Whatever the GPs decide to do, we'll certainly cover it when it happens. Thanks, Helena, for joining me tonight and taking me through my inaugural Novara Live hosting. And thanks, everyone, for watching this evening. We'll be back tomorrow from 6. For now, you can watch Novara Media. Good night.